Let's take a look at an application where we can use our repository interface. Let's go ahead and start by running to look at our UI. Here we have a number of buttons, one each for our different repositories, a service repository, a CSV repository, and a SQL repository. We also have a clear data button that will clear out our data. On the right-hand side, we have a list box, and this will show the output that's coming from each of our repositories. If we look in our personrepository.interface project, we see our iPersonRepository interface. This is the same interface that we looked at before. It has the create, read, update, and delete methods. Now the order of the methods is rearranged a little bit. We'll be primarily dealing with the getPeople method, so we moved that up to the top. One thing to note about getPeople, the return type is IEnumerable of person. So we can actually use interfaces as return types for our methods as well. What this means is that each of our classes that implements this interface can return whatever concrete class they want as long as it implements IEnumerable of person. So if they want to return a list of person or a person array or an observable collection of person, that's just fine. So now that we've seen our interface, let's take a look at the service project that we have. Inside people.service, we have a person service. This is just a WCF SOAP service that we can use in our service repository. Notice it also has similar methods to what we saw in our interface, but these are technically unrelated. Using CRUD operations to access data is a pretty common way of doing it. If we look at our getPeople method, we'll see that this is just a hard-coded collection of person objects. Normally in a WCF service, we would be getting this data from a real data store, perhaps a SQL server or somewhere else, but for our example, we're more concerned of showing the interaction between our repository and a service, and where the actual service data is coming from isn't important for this sample. Notice that our service is returning a list of person for this getPeople method. So now that we've seen the WCF service, let's go ahead and create a repository that will interact with that. So let's come up to our repository folder and we'll right-click and we'll add a new project. This project will be a class library, and we'll go ahead and call this personrepository.service. And there'll be a few things we need to add to this. Since we do want to use the interface, we'll need to add a reference to our personrepository.interface project so that we have that available to us. In addition, since we are using the person service, we need to add a service reference. Here, we'll go ahead and click the Discover button, and this will just find all of the services that are part of our solution. Here's our person service, and we'll give it a namespace of my service, just something that we can remember for later. I'm going to go into the advanced features and change our collection type from array to generic list. So this way we can interact with list of person rather than a person array. When we click OK, it will create all of the proxies for our service repository class. The last thing we'll do is we'll rename our class file. So instead of class 1, we'll call this service repository. And when it asks, we'll say yes, we want to rename the class as well. Let's go ahead and build and just make sure that everything works. So now that we have our class, it's time to add our interface. First, let's add a using statement for personrepository.interface. Now we can come to our service repository and say that this needs to implement iPersonRepository. Now here's something important. If we try to build right now, we get a build failure. That's because we've committed to implementing all of the members of the interface. That turns out to be 6 different methods. Since we haven't implemented any of them, we get a build failure. We are not fulfilling the contract. So what's the easiest way to fulfill the contract? If we go back to our interface, we could copy and paste all of these method signatures into our class, but we'd have to make some modifications, and that's kind of an ugly way of doing it. It turns out Visual Studio wants to help us implement interfaces, so let's go ahead and let it do it for us. If we click on the iPerson repository, notice the blue rectangle that's underneath the I. This is a clue from Visual Studio saying, hey, maybe I can help you with this. If you're a keyboard person, just press Control Dot and you'll get a pop-up menu. You'll get the same menu if you right-click on that. Notice we have two options, Implement Interface iPerson Repository and Explicitly Implement Interface iPerson Repository. Now we'll be covering explicit implementation a little bit later. For now, we'll just go ahead and implement it normally. Now notice what Visual Studio did for us. It actually created stubs for every single one of the members of our interface. So we have get people, get person, add person, update person, delete person, and update people. Now you can see these implementations aren't very useful. They just throw not implemented exceptions. But if we build, we do get a successful build. That's because technically our repository does fulfill the contract. It implements all of the members. There's nothing in the contract that says the members have to do something useful. Although, as we'll see, that's usually the best way of doing it. So let's go ahead and add a reference to our WCF service. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a person service client. Now notice I don't have IntelliSense on this. That's because I haven't added the using statement for this yet. Notice the little blue rectangle under the P. If I press Control Dot, one of the options I have here is to add a using statement. Let's go ahead and do that. Now you'll see up in my using section, I have a reference for using personrepository.service.myservice. Now one caveat when you're using this functionality, you do need to type in the type name exactly as it needs to appear, including capitalization. Otherwise, it won't bring in the using statement appropriately. So we'll go ahead and call this service proxy, and we'll just new it up. So now that we have this, we can use it in each of our methods. And again, since our service basically implements exactly these same methods, we can just use our repository as a pass-through to our service. So here we can say service proxy.getPeople. And notice this returns a list of person, which does fulfill our contract, IEnumerable of person. So we can just return the value that's coming back from this. We can do the same thing with the rest of our members. So for getPerson, we can just return service proxy.getPerson and then pass through the last name parameter. For addPerson, we'll call service proxy.addPerson and pass in the new person parameter. So you're probably getting a good idea of what we're doing here. Last name and updated person. And then for delete, service proxy.deletePerson. And for update people, we'll say service proxy.updatePeople, and we'll pass in our updated people collection. But one thing to note here is we do have a little bit of a type mismatch. Notice that our updatePeople method on our service proxy wants a list of person, but the type we're actually getting in is an IEnumerable of person. Well, it turns out we can just say .toList, and that will turn the IEnumerable of person into a list of person automatically. Now that we have our implementation, let's go ahead and build. Now we can see we have a fairly straightforward repository here. It's primarily acting as a pass-through to the WCF service. One last thing I like to do after my class is complete is I like to organize my using statements. So I'll come up into my using block, right-click, say Organize Using, and then Remove and Sort. That will get rid of any using statements for assemblies I'm not using in this particular code block. Let's go ahead and do a final build. Now that we have a fully implemented repository, it's time to incorporate this into our application. Let's go ahead and close the files that we have right now and collapse some of these projects. Now the project that we're working in is our People Viewer project. Again, this is our UI application. Normally we would have more layers in a full application, but we're trying to keep things simple. So again, we have a main window.xaml, and this includes the 4 buttons and the list box. And we'll be looking at the code behind here. And notice that we do already have event handlers in place for each of our buttons. But before we can start filling those in, we need to add some references for our new repository. So let's go to our references. We'll right-click and say Add Reference. And we'll want to include a reference for personrepository.service, the project that we just created. Now that we've done this, we can just add a using statement for personrepository.service, and we can start using our repository. So what we're going to do is implement the service fetch button click event handler. And this will look very similar to the implementation we did in our previous example. So first we'll start by clearing our list box. And then we need to get a reference to our repository. Now I'm going to use iPersonRepository as the type, and we're going to call this repository. Now we want to call the getPeople method on our repository. Now I want to point out, if I say repository dot, we will see all of the members of our interface. So we do see add person, delete person, get people, get person, update people, and update person. And the other members that we see in here, just like we were looking at before, these are members of the object class. So that means we can call repository.getPeople. Now notice I'm not referencing any concrete type here. I'm just referencing the interface. Now I do need to assign this to something, so we'll assign this to a new service repository. So that will get us an instance of our repository interface. Now to get what's coming back, we'll just create a variable called people, and that will get our people collection out of the repository. Then we'll do the same for each that we saw earlier. So for each person and people, personListBox.items.add person. So that will add each item to our list box. Finally, we do have one last method here called showRepositoryType. And for this, we'll go ahead and pass it our iPersonRepository. Let's see what this method is doing. If we click into it, we see this does a messagebox.show, and what it does is it looks at our repository, calls the getType method, and then calls toString on that. What this will do is it will get the concrete type of whatever iPersonRepository we pass in. So that means we'll be able to see what the concrete type is for whatever repository we happen to be using. Now there is one last thing we need to do to our application before we can continue. We need to do a little bit of configuration to tell it where to find our WCF service. So in our app config, I already have a section in here, which are the settings for our service repository. And this is just a system.service model section. Here's the address that you should look at in order to find where this WCF service is. When we try to call the web service, this is how it finds it. So now when we run our application, we can click on our service repository button, and notice that we did get a pop-up message that's telling us our concrete repository type is personrepository.service.service repository. So we can see we are actually using our service repository in this instance. And of course, you can see we have populated data in our list box. So we've seen how we can implement a service repository. Our next step will be implementing a couple more repositories so that we can see how easy it is to extend our application.